When is a language a language? What constitutes a language? And I sort of am thinking about this question as I'm heading off on my trip to Denmark, Sweden, and Poland. And I've been practicing my Danish and my Polish. My Swedish is already fairly good. And so then I think to myself, well, Danish and Swedish and Norwegian are very, very close. They're kind of mutually comprehensible. The Danes have an easier time understanding the Swedes than the Norwegians. The Swedes have a harder time understanding the Danes, but essentially the vocabulary is very, very similar. The structure is very, very similar, and yet they are recognized as separate languages. Now I move on to Polish, which I've been essentially only listening to and reading, and I don't know how I'm going to do there. I will certainly do some videos when I'm in Poland. In Denmark, I might do some videos, and you'll see that I'll still be speaking Swedish, but they'll understand me. I don't think I'll be pronouncing Danish. But when I'm in Poland, I'm in a totally different language system. So if I'm going to try to say anything, I'm going to have to say it in Polish. Now, I know other Slavic languages, but they're sufficiently different. And no one suggests that Polish is actually Czech or Ukrainian or... It's a separate language. There is no issue there whatsoever. But these languages influence each other. So if you say, take Czech and Slovak, now those are considered separate languages, but they're so similar that Czechs and Slovaks have absolutely no difficulty understanding each other. So why is that two separate languages? Question. All right. A similar situation occurs in the Balkans, where, Slovenian is somewhat of an outlier, but Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian are so similar that probably, differences within those countries can be as great as the differences between those languages. And yet there are some people who say, well, I speak, Serbian, I don't speak Croatian. But a majority of people there, from what I've heard, agree that it's essentially one language, although Serbian can use the Cyrillic alphabet, but also does use the Latin alphabet at times. I don't fully understand why they use the one or the other. Also in the Balkans, you have Macedonian and Bulgarian that are very similar. Again, I don't speak either of those languages. So you start to see where sort of the political situation tends to determine whether a form of a language is considered a language. In other words, is there a country there? But that's not necessarily clear either because, in Canada, we have people in Quebec and in New Brunswick and elsewhere in Canada who speak French, but we have two languages, so it's a bilingual country. The situation of Ukrainian, there are people in Russia who don't want to admit that the Ukrainian language exists, when in fact, I don't know the full story of the evolution of Ukrainian and the Belarusian language. I think they were essentially the Ruthenian language, and that was one form of, say, Eastern Slavic languages, and Russian was a sort of a different form. And the lexical distance, in other words, the vocabulary, as between, Russian and Ukrainian, is actually more distant than, say, the relationship between Ukrainian and Polish, getting back to my Polish situation. And of course, there are all kinds of historical reasons why that's the case. If we look at Asia, for example, there's 90 million speakers of Cantonese, yet Cantonese, is it a language or is it a dialect? The interesting thing is that most Cantonese speakers consider themselves to be Chinese and are not that interested in having a separate language status for Cantonese. To the best of my knowledge, some do, but a majority don't. The ones that I have met, they don't make a big deal out of the fact that Cantonese is a separate language. They're happy to speak Cantonese. They have Cantonese radio, but they're Chinese and they speak Chinese. In Taiwan, you have this Minnan language, which is also spoken in the southern part of Fujian province. That seems to be more recognized as a separate language, although, again, I'm not an expert, so maybe it's just considered a dialect of Chinese. You often hear Chinese languages, what I would consider to be languages, are considered dialects because that's how the people who speak those languages seem to look upon them, from what I can tell. I'm not knowledgeable about differences between Indonesian and Malaysian, for example, or Thai and Laotian, or any of those situations. I'm not at all familiar with them. So at what point is it a language? At what point is it a dialect? If you go back to Europe, of course, there used to be a lot more regional languages in France, in Italy, in Germany, for example. And then gradually there was this sort of centralizing trend in the 19th century in particular, as part of the sort of national awakening. So the Germans have got to have one language, the French have got to have one language, and the Italians, and they ended up essentially discouraging and in some cases depressing or even forbidding people from speaking these regional languages. In Spain, the regional languages seem to have survived better. So Catalan and Gallego, Galician, is still there as a regional language within the Romance group. Of course, Basque is another regional language. And even within the Catalan language, some people in the Balearic Islands or Valencia say that their language is different. It's a different language, or is it Catalan? Again, I don't know. I'm not in those discussions. But there is a sort of subjective nature as to what we consider to be a language. I have no familiarity with Nahuatl, for example, in Mexico, but I understand that there are some interesting situations with Nahuatl or Guarani in Paraguay, that they're most closely related sort of native Native American language may not be the one that's nearby, but sometimes there's one from further away. But they are certainly recognized as languages. We have the case of Esperanto. There is no Esperanto country. But people who speak Esperanto feel very strongly that it's an important language. So maybe the decision on whether something is a language or not, or a dialect, that should depend on what the speakers of that language think and believe. I think if the speaker of a certain language says, I speak language X, it's a language, it's not a dialect, I think we have to accept that. And if that gains general acceptance, then not only is the speaker of that language saying it's not a dialect, it's a language, but if we accept it, then it gains general acceptance, and then that then becomes a language and not a dialect. But it's a difficult situation. People might refer to, say, the Haitian, what do they call it? The Creole. Sometimes the term patois is used to describe a sort of, a hybrid language. But look at the languages of Europe that, emanated from Latin in France and in Spain and so forth, the Iberian Peninsula. They must have been some form of patois. Even English, which is a hodgepodge mixture of, I guess there's some Celtic words in there, I don't know, but predominantly Germanic words and words, not so much from the Romans, it turns out, but more from the Norman French. And out of that evolution, patois, whatever you want to call it, came the language that is known today as English. So the fact that a language is a mixture of other languages, or that it's a sort of process of evolution, none of that is disqualifying. None of that is strange. It's all a part of how languages evolve. And ultimately, the decision on whether a patois or a Creole or a dialect is a language or not becomes and remains quite subjective. So I look forward to lots of comment from people who know a lot more about this subject than I do. Thank you for listening.